There is a rule in every fleet manual ever written by every species that has ever left its homeworld. When the relay fails, you abandon the relay. You do not stay behind for a machine. You do not stay behind for a room full of blinking lights and dying batteries. The relay is replaceable. The person operating it is not. Nobody told Corporal Eli Vance that rule applied to him, or if they did, he had stopped listening several hours before the Kailash Compact's third fleet broke formation over the debris field once called the Threnody Belt. He was 31 years old, 5 years into a contract he had signed because Earth's Veteran Benefits Office told him relay work paid better than dockside loading and required less lifting. He had a photograph of his sister's kids taped to the inside of his console, curling at the corners from the humidity of a life support system that had been overworking itself since the siege began. He had not slept in 38 hours. When Fleet Command gave the order to scuttle Relay Station Threnody 9 and evacuate, Eli Vance looked at the 17 refugee transports still 3 hours out from the jump corridor, looked at the swarm of Ashvari raiders converging on that corridor like sharks smelling blood and water, and made a decision that would be studied by 4 separate species for the next 100 years. He stayed. The station groaned around him, its hull already scored by shrapnel from the first wave of the assault. Threnody 9 had never been built to survive combat. It was a communications waypoint, a glorified lighthouse bolted to an asteroid, its only weapons a pair of point defense turrets meant to swat away debris, not warships. Its only value was the relay itself, the ancient half-understood quantum bridge that let ships jump blind through the belt without slamming into rock at 9/10 light speed. Without a live signal from Threnody 9, no ship could jump that corridor. With Threnody 9 gone, the 17 transports, carrying the last of the Vithrani colonial population, families and elders and children who had already lost one homeworld to this war, would have to go the long way around. 4 days around. 4 days that the Ashvari raiders, hungry and merciless and closing fast, would use to hunt them down one by one in open space. Eli did the math the way his sister used to help him do math at the kitchen table when he was 9 years old and hated fractions. He did it slow, and he did it twice because he wanted to be sure. 17 ships, roughly 11,000 people, 3 hours to the corridor, one relay operator standing between all of it and nothing. He thought briefly about his sister. Not in any grand or cinematic way. He did not compose a farewell speech in his head, did not imagine her face at the moment the math ran out. He thought about the fact that she had taught him fractions at a kitchen table in a house that no longer existed, in a city that had been rebuilt twice since the Ashvari incursions began, and that somewhere in that rebuilding she had raised 2 kids who would grow up in a galaxy that either had room for people like his sister or didn't. He decided, in the quiet, practical way he decided most things, that he would rather spend the next few hours finding out which kind of galaxy it was than spend them finding out whether he personally survived it. He opened a channel to the evacuation shuttle waiting at his own airlock and told the pilot to leave without him. The pilot, a Usrai named Doral Kaith, who had worked beside Eli for 2 years and considered him something between a colleague and an exhibit. Humans still fascinated the Usrai, who found their short lifespans and stubborn optimism baffling in equal measure, argued for 4 full minutes. Eli let him argue. It was easier than explaining. When Doral finally asked why, what in the algorithms of human reasoning produced a decision this absurd, Eli only said that somebody had to keep the light on, and the shuttle only had room for people who needed to get somewhere, and he didn't need to get anywhere. He was already exactly where he needed to be. Doral left. Eli did not watch the shuttle go. He was already elbow-deep in the relay's guidance conduit, rerouting power from every non-essential system on the station into the signal array, because he had done the math a 3rd time and realized that even fully staffed Threnody 9's transmission strength would not be enough to guide 17 ships through a debris field this dense while under fire. He needed more range, more clarity, more time. He did not have any of those things in storage, so he built them. He shut down life support to every compartment he wasn't standing in. He vented the atmosphere from 4 cargo bays to kill the risk of secondary explosions if the hull took a hit, and he did this knowing it meant that if his own section breached, there would be nowhere left to retreat to. He pulled the coolant lines from the unused barracks and rerouted them into the relay's transmitter core, because an overheating transmitter was a transmitter that clipped its own signal, and a clipped signal was a dead colonist. He was not an engineer. He had a technician's certification and 4 years of field experience, and a stubbornness that his instructors back on Earth had once flagged in his file as a disciplinary concern. Nobody on Threnody 9 had ever needed that stubbornness before. Tonight, it was the only resource he had left that hadn't already run out. The Ashvari raiders hit the outer debris field 40 minutes later, and the first transport pilot to reach the corridor screamed over open comms that she couldn't see a clean path, that the relay signal was too faint to resolve the rock formations fast enough to plot a jump, that she was going to have to abort and try to outrun the raiders in open space instead, which everyone listening already knew was a sentence with only one ending. Eli told her to hold. He did not have a plan when he said it. He found the plan in the 90 seconds after he said it, because there is a particular kind of clarity that arrives only when the alternative is watching a woman die on an open channel while you do nothing. He overloaded the relay's primary emitter by 14% past its rated ceiling, a number his instruments told him with mathematical certainty would burn out the array within the hour, and used the surge to punch a signal clean and bright through the debris field, painting the safe corridor in real time for every transport in the swarm. It worked. It worked because he had already stripped every other system on the station bare to keep that one array cool enough to survive the overload, and because a man who has decided he is not leaving has a very different relationship with risk than a man who is planning his exit. The first transport made the jump, then the second. He talked each pilot through the resolving corridor as it narrowed and widened with the shifting debris, his voice flat and steady in a way that had nothing to do with how his hands were shaking, because 11,000 people were listening to that voice to decide whether they lived, and none of them needed to hear that the man giving directions was terrified. The Ashvari raiders reached the relay station itself during the 9th transport's jump window. They did not understand at first what they were looking at. Ashvari combat doctrine assumed that a communications outpost under this kind of pressure would already be dark, its crew evacuated, its systems dead, an empty shell to be swept aside on the way to easier prey. Instead, they found a station still broadcasting at full power, still painting a corridor for fleeing transports, still very much occupied. Their commander, a raider captain named Voskler who had spent 11 years hunting refugee convoys and had never once encountered resistance from an evacuated waypoint, diverted 2 gunships to silence it personally, more out of professional curiosity than tactical necessity. 11,000 refugees were already most of the way to being unreachable. One man on a dying station was not worth the fuel. He sent the gunships anyway. Later, when compact investigators interviewed him after the war's end, he would say it was because the signal made him uneasy, and an uneasy raider does not leave things half-finished. Eli watched the gunships close on his position through a targeting display that had not been designed to track incoming fire, because Threnody 9 had never been meant to take fire, and understood with total clarity that he had perhaps 6 minutes before the station's exterior hull stopped existing as a meaningful barrier between himself and vacuum. He used those 6 minutes to talk the 10th, 11th, and 12th transports through the corridor. He did not use them to find a way to survive because there wasn't one, and he had already decided 3 hours earlier that finding one wasn't the assignment he'd given himself. The gunships opened fire at 4 minutes. The station's point-defense turrets, running on a fraction of their normal power because Eli had bled every spare watt into the relay array, managed to intercept exactly one of the incoming volleys before a second struck the station's spine, and the lights in Eli's compartment went out entirely, replaced by the harsh red bleed of emergency lighting, and the scream of a hull breach alarm 2 decks up that meant the air he was breathing had somewhere between 11 and 14 minutes left in it. According to a readout he had memorized without meaning to, he kept talking. The 13th transport made the jump on backup power alone, because the primary relay array had gone dark in the strike, and Eli had rerouted a hand terminal, a piece of equipment meant for nothing more demanding than logging cargo manifests, directly into the station's remaining transmitter coil, broadcasting a corridor signal so thin and so degraded that the 14th transport's navigator later said it looked less like a beacon and more like a single candle held up in a hurricane. And that she had followed it anyway because it was the only light there was. Voskler's second volley found the compartment Eli was standing in at 11 minutes and 19 seconds, and it did not kill him, which both of them would later agree was the more improbable outcome of the encounter. It threw him across the room, cracked 3 ribs, opened a gash along his scalp that filled his left eye with blood, and knocked the hand terminal from his grip into a spray of sparking debris that used to be a workstation. He crawled to find it. He does not remember doing this, not clearly, not in the way he remembers everything else about that night. He has said in every interview since that the next several minutes exist in his memory only as fragments: the taste of blood, the cold of the deck plating through a torn glove, a voice that he eventually realized was his own, still reciting corridor coordinates to transports he could no longer see on any display, because the display had died with the terminal and he was working now from memory, from the last confirmed debris map. From arithmetic done in his own skull with his own blood running into his own mouth. The 15th transport jumped clean. The 16th clipped a rock formation on entry and lost a maneuvering thruster but made it through. The 17th, carrying 412 people including 61 children under the age of 10, was still 8 minutes out from the corridor when the station's remaining power reserves gave out entirely, and the signal, thin as it already was, finally died. Lee did not have a terminal left to work with. He did not have power left to draw on. He had a suit radio with maybe 20 minutes of charge, a debris map memorized in fragments through a haze of blood and adrenaline, and a stubbornness that had got him this far and had no intention of stopping now simply because the equipment had run out before he had. He read the corridor to the 17th transport's pilot from memory, over a suit radio, in a voice roughened by a scalp wound and 3 cracked ribs in 38 hours without sleep, and he did not get a single coordinate wrong. The transport made the jump with 40 seconds of margin. Voskler's forces found the station's last functioning compartment 9 minutes later and boarded to confirm the kill, expecting, by his own later account, to find either an empty room or a corpse. They found instead a single human sitting upright against a bulkhead, one eye swollen shut, 3 ribs visibly wrong beneath a torn uniform, still holding a suit radio to his mouth, though the channel had gone silent minutes before because there was nothing left to say and no one left who needed him to say it. Voskler did not kill him. He would say later to compact investigators who did not entirely believe him and recorded his statement anyway, that killing a man who had already finished what he set out to do felt less like victory and more like theft. And that he had spent 11 years hunting refugees and had never once needed to ask himself what kind of raider he wanted to be until he stood in that ruined compartment and looked at a man who had bled out 3/4 of his blood supply, refusing to leave a light on for people he would never meet. He took Eli Vance prisoner instead of a corpse, which under Ashvari custom of that era was itself a kind of tribute, and 11 months later, when a prisoner exchange finally reached the Threnody sector, handed him back to compact forces personally, along with a translated account of what he had found in that compartment, because he wanted it on record exactly what it had cost. 11,040 people reached safe harbor because Threnody 9's relay stayed lit 14 minutes longer than any engineer would have called possible, and every serious study of the action since has agreed on the same conclusion, phrased a dozen different ways in a dozen different languages. The array should have failed. The corridor should have gone dark. The math on every axis anyone can measure said that station should have gone silent long before the 17th transport ever reached the belt. It didn't, because somewhere in that equation was a variable none of the fleet manuals had accounted for: a stubborn, undersleeping, badly trained relay technician who had decided, 3 hours before any of it mattered, that he was already exactly where he needed to be, and who simply refused, ribs cracked and blood in his eye and every system beneath him failing in sequence, to let that stop being true. The Vithrani have a phrase now, adopted in 6 compact languages in the years since, that they use whenever someone asks what it means to trust a promise completely. They call it Vancel's Light, a small mistranslation of Eli's name that nobody has ever bothered to correct, because by the time anyone noticed, the phrase had already outgrown the man it was named for. It doesn't mean bravery, not exactly, and it doesn't mean sacrifice, though it holds room for both. It means a signal that stays lit past the point where staying lit stops making sense. It means the corridor that appears exactly when you've stopped believing one will. Humanity did not ask to be known for this. No recruiter ever put it in a pamphlet. But 11 months after the siege of the Threnody Belt, when Voskler stood in a neutral prisoner exchange facility and handed a battered, half-healed human back to his own people, he said something that made its way into the official record and has stayed there ever since, quoted by academics and children alike whenever the story of that night is retold. That he had spent his career hunting the weak points in every fleet he'd ever faced, and that on the worst night of a long war he had finally found a species with none. He was wrong, of course. Humans have plenty of weak points. Eli Vance would tell you that himself if you asked. He'd tell you about the fear, about the 38 hours without sleep, about how close he came to leaving on that shuttle before he stopped himself. But he would also tell you, in that same flat and steady voice that once guided 17 ships through a debris field held together by nothing but stubbornness and static, that a weak point only matters if you let it decide what you do next. There is a footnote to the story that rarely makes it into the retellings, though Eli has always insisted it belongs there. When Compact Forces finally debriefed him, months after his release, one of the interviewing officers asked him, half as procedure, half out of genuine curiosity, whether he had known in that last quarter hour with a suit radio and a memorized map and nothing else that it would work. Whether some part of him had been certain the 17th transport would make it. He said no. He said he hadn't been certain of anything except the coordinates, and that certainty about outcomes was a luxury he'd never actually had access to, not at any point that night, not when he sent the shuttle away, and not when he crawled across a burning deck to keep a dead terminal's replacement alive with nothing but his own memory. What he'd had instead, he said, was something smaller and less impressive sounding, something that didn't translate cleanly into Vithrani or Usrai or the clipped military dialect the Ashvari used among themselves. The simple, stubborn refusal to find out what happened if he stopped. It is, in the end, the least dramatic answer anyone could have given, and it is also the one that the story's every retelling circles back to, in every language it has since been translated into, because it turns out that is the part nobody quite knows what to do with. Not the courage which people understand, not the sacrifice which people expect. Just a man who kept doing the next necessary thing over and over, past the point where any reasonable calculation would have told him to stop, because he had decided at the very start of the night that the light stayed on and had never once revisited the decision. He didn't, and 11,040 people are alive today because of it.